Hey guys, this is a behind the scenes on my appearance on Blake's Dev Dream podcast. I assume most of you are here because you already saw it, but if you haven't, go check it out. So yeah, I just wanted to go into the behind the scenes and talk some about the things I didn't get to talk about on the podcast because we ran out of time. This isn't a drama video or anything. Blake was great to talk with. There was nothing surprising or controversial behind the scenes. I just thought it would be interesting to give people a behind the scenes look and talk about some of the things I didn't get to in the podcast. A logical place to start with the behind the scenes is how I even got on the podcast to begin with, since I'm kind of a nobody in the game development world, and I actually owe that to Payne Robinson, the creator of Execute, and his YouTube channel. You should go subscribe to it. He made a video about networking and just how it's good to talk and connect with other developers, and to just be brave enough to ask people for a conversation, to ask people to do something like connect over a podcast. Even if you're not big in the scene yet, and you'd be surprised how many people say yes. And you should always ask, because the worst that can happen is they'll say no or something.
We're all just out here developing games, being like, I'm the only one out here. I'm just by myself making the greatest game of all time, and no one understands me or my vision.
So it was really because of that video I asked Blake if I could be on the podcast. I was already part of his community, hanging out in the Discord, so I just shot him a message, and he was like, just email me. So I just emailed him with a brief overview. I tried to keep it short and just focus on the things I thought could be interesting and show how I could possibly be a guest that would have interesting things to say. And then I heard nothing for over a month. I applied May 14th, and it was like late June, hadn't heard anything, so I decided to do my own thing. I had a podcast with Connor. But then around the same time, over a month and a half after I applied, he got back to me and was like, hey, is this a good time to chat? I said, yes, of course. And then heard nothing. Like, there's no, okay, great, I'll talk to you then. There's no Google Calendar invite. So actually, up until the very day we did it, I wasn't sure if it was going to happen. I was like, is this still on? I couldn't figure out. Like, I messaged him on Discord and he didn't reply. And then like 2 hours before we were supposed to record, I finally got an email from him with all the questions and topics he wanted to talk about. So I was like, all right, okay, this is still on. And so like any normal person, I spent those 2 hours writing up a reply to every question he might ask on the podcast, because I have to plan every conversation. I'm not very articulate or good at talking, so I was very worried that I would kind of run out of things to say if I didn't prep for it. Of course, I'm the kind of guy who feels like I need to plan for a regular conversation too, so hopefully that awkwardness didn't come across too much in our conversation. I didn't actually end up using those notes much. Like, writing them probably helped, but he asked questions off script and didn't ask them in order, and like I didn't bother to keep up with my notes or anything. I just kind of answered off the cuff, but probably it still helped me have stuff to say, to have thought about it in advance and written down some stuff, even if I didn't actually use the notes. So yeah, then we jumped on the call, and I was kind of surprised. Like, for me and Connor, I tried to chat with him for like 30 to 40 minutes to get ourselves comfortable chatting with each other. For me and Blake, like, it was like maybe 2 to 5 minutes, and then bam, we're on. So like what you see in the podcast is basically my first experience interacting with Blake, which didn't help me being awkward and nervous, but hopefully it didn't come across too badly. Yeah, I had a tendency to monologue forever, and so I was trying to rein that in by stopping to pause when I was talking about something so that he could, ask a question about something for more clarification or dive deeper into something. But a lot of times when I did that, instead of continuing on whatever I was talking about that I had a lot more to say, he would jump to a completely different topic. And of course, I'm sure I could have said, hey, Blake, I still have more to say about that. We could chat a bit more about before we move on. But I kind of trusted Blake to know when the audience would want to move on. Like, I figured I was in good hands with his hosting. And, watching it back, I think that was right. Like, most of the time when he moves on to a new topic, even if it had more to say, it was probably good to keep the conversation moving, because as it is, we didn't get to so much before the episode was over. But I figured just in this behind the scenes, I would talk about some of the things I had planned to get to, even though we didn't quite get to during the actual conversation. So one was my modding history. Like, we kind of started with Cradle of Death, which is my mission that came second in Blizzard's contest and won $7,000 and got adapted into the game. But That was kind of the end of my modding career. I had been modding since like when I was 8 or 9 in Warcraft 3. Like around 2007 is when I finally made a Warcraft 3 map that actually got popular enough. People were hosting it, and if I joined a lobby, people would be like, the guy who made it's here, when I was around 11 or 12. But then even in StarCraft 2, which I'd been modding since it came out in like 2010, like there's so many more mods we could have talked about. I made one that got mentioned on Kotaku, which was this race swap mod where each race had the same mechanics but swapped the visuals. Like Marines would be Protoss, but all the Protoss units would be Zerg and etc.
And when you need to base trade, you can just lift off your... That makes absolutely no sense.
And that was full of jokes. Like all of my mods are silly in some way.
Really high Templar.
There was Shamans of Conquest, which turned StarCraft 2 into this sprawling fantasy game that's like a combination of an RTS and Risk with like god powers. There was Probe Wars, which was based off of a Minecraft mod where you'd use like TNT cannons to blow up each other's ships. There was Zergling Clicker, which we talked about a little bit, but we could have gone into more, like the mechanics behind making a PvP free-for-all competitive incremental game. It had heavier cookie clicker inspiration than Goblins for Good. Even had like the news ticker with just funny things at the top the whole game long. Then there was my second incremental game, which was Desert Strike.
Oh, I see. So it's like cookie clicker. So we're gonna slap these. We gotta slap these desserts until we can buy our first thing that'll automatically start attacking them. See?
Which was a pun off of the very popular StarCraft 2 Desert Strike mod. It was again very silly. It had recipes for all the desserts in it.
A dessert stricken down once will reappear, rising again from the baker's ovens, the factory conveyors, and the creamery's churns. This war is an eternal one. For as bad as dessert is, people still love it.
So many silly things we could have talked about with that game.
So whatever's up right now... I didn't expect this. He actually copy-pasted the source and the entire recipe of every single dessert that we are attacking. It's only natural that a game about clicking on pictures of sweet pastries would be paid content. How else will the developers of Desert Strike have the budget to implement premium features like a recipe for grandmas not to be trifled with radical UI skins?
Then I started to make like a prototype for this epic game that would have been Patreon funded. That was kind of like my point of giving up modding and throwing in the towel and going on to college and stuff. So we could have talked about that experience too. But then even when we got to like Cradle of Death, we brushed over that pretty quickly. We didn't talk about what I did that made the mission unique, like my design philosophies of like player agency, player expression, bringing in mechanics like scouting that are part of multiplayer but weren't really part of co-op, like all the things I did in that game to make what would have been an annoying escort mission to some cool power fantasy where you could upgrade the trucks and, you know, it's different types of enemy hybrids. But one of the more interesting stories we didn't get to talk about with that is that I actually talked to someone who wasn't part of Blizzard yet, during like the voting phase of the contest, who had certain strong opinions about things they did wrong in the mission. Like he thought the payloads should have just moved by themselves instead of being player controlled. And I was arguing like, no, them being player controlled is what makes this unique from every other mission. His name was Monk, Kevin Dong, and he went on to actually work for Blizzard, and he was working at Blizzard when my mission got adapted by Blizzard into the mission pool. And speaking of the adaptation, like they made huge changes, and one of the things I would have loved to talk about with Blake was actually how upon release, their adapted version of my mission was the most hated co-op mission, which is a very interesting experience, having players hate something that you quote-unquote made, but Blizzard's version was like, it ruined everything good about it. Like, I'd get comments on both my videos and other people's videos about the mission, and just see forum discussions where people who actually played my version were like, his version, the original version, was great, and Blizzard just ruined it. So it was a very interesting conversation we could have had there about that feeling of your name being on something that someone else kind of took in a very different direction that ended up being hated by the community, even though my version was beloved. So that would have been an interesting conversation that we just didn't get to have. Another kind of funny thing, this is a side tangent, but I had a lot of Easter eggs in my version, and Blizzard actually kept one of my Easter eggs, but added a twist to it where their voice actor actually said my name and the name of another person who helped, who was actually the voice actor for my version, which is another thing we could have talked about, that I got voice acting for my entry into this contest.
Oh yes, it's time for explosions. Ah, Commanders! Intel reports birthing chambers for a hybrid more powerful than we can possibly imagine. These hybrids would be unstoppable if they were to birth. Payload is ready for you to command. Each of you will need to command a payload to the birthing stations to blow them up. Look at that explosion!
So yeah, a lot more we could have talked about with Cradle of Death. Also, there's other stuff we could have talked about from my StarCraft days, like more of my interactions with Blizzard. I would help them with behind-the-scenes stuff, like setting up streams. There's one time where they had an ARPG to market the Nova Covert Ops mission pack, and when the community got stuck at certain points, they would actually feed me hints to feed through the community, so it felt like it was coming from the players, not from them, if it was not progressing fast enough for their marketing beats and stuff like that. So yeah, more we could have talked about from the Blizzard days for sure. Finally, you know, after the conversation, I was kind of wondering what Blake would take the direction of, like, the title and thumbnail and hook of the episode. Was it going to be my experience coming second in a Blizzard contest and, like, winning all this money as, like, you know, a 20-year-old? Was the Uno reverse thing gonna be like something he used as a hook, or the fact that I'm donating 90% of the profits from my first indie release to charity, was that gonna be, well, like, the hook or something? What I was most worried about was him using actually my negative experiences at the startup I worked for, because I'm kind of hoping they don't see in the episode and some of the negative things I saw about them. They made me sign a exit NDA, which is where after you leave a company, you promise not to join a company that would compete with them, and you promise not to ever say anything bad about them, and, like, ridiculous things that I'm not even sure are legally enforceable. And they used to actually stalk my socials and make sure, like, I was actually following every NDA and stuff. So I was kind of hoping they didn't see this episode, and that if they did, that he didn't use my negative experiences of them as a hook. And don't get me wrong, like, if I brought this up with Blake and said, hey, could you change the title or thumbnail, or, you know, I wasn't comfortable with this, can you edit it out? I'm sure he would. I don't have a big enough problem with it to do that. Like, if he thinks it's going to be a better hook for the video, go for it. I didn't say anything I wasn't comfortable with, but at the same time, I kind of wish I could have talked more about the good experiences of working there, and some of the accomplishments I had. Like, we didn't get into, like, I had to rewrite a peer's game because he didn't know very good programming at all, and it was a mess. So I ended up having to rewrite someone else's entire game from scratch in, like, a couple of weeks, which was a huge challenge. Like, trying to even figure out his nest of a script file where, like, the code base was duplicated twice and branched off in different directions. Like, trying to figure that out and reprogram it from scratch in a super tight deadline. Other things, like, for a while, I was pretty much solely in charge of releasing bi-weekly content drops for a game with millions of players. And how I actually managed to do that, like, deliver new content every 2 weeks with, like, new levels, new cards, new heroes, like, new gameplay mechanics and ideas, and have it not be too buggy, have it reach a high enough level of quality, and largely doing it by myself, and eventually not only leading a team to do it, but also setting up, like, procedures so that after I moved on to a different role, the rest of the team could keep following, like, the documents and guidelines and processes I came up with. Look, I had crazy experiences from that day, and some of them were good, not just the negative stuff we ended up touching on. So yeah, and I wish I had been able to talk about more of my experiences there, but at the same time, I also kind of wish that the focus of the podcast could have been more on some of these other positive things, like the Blizzard contest or Goblins for Good, and not as much on trying to make it look like a sob story, the experience I had there. And obviously there's, like, some good that comes from talking about negative things that happen in the gaming industry, because companies like that taking advantage of people who have a dream to make games only to mistreat them and underpay them and all these other things, like, that needs to be talked about. So I don't have a problem with talking about it on the podcast, and if Blake thinks that's going to make the best hook, like, I don't have an issue with it. So don't make this into a drama thing where, like, you know, obviously I'm sure Blake would be totally cool with changing that if I wanted him to. But I think there's just some internal conflict with me there, and hopefully it'll turn out well. Another thing I thought we could have talked about more is how insane it is for me to talk about doing, like, a small scoped game for my first game and have it be like a 3D game with pathfinding, ragdolls, splats, and then all the server code for like votes for the player charity voting. Like Goblins for Good, I don't know, maybe it comes across as being like kind of proud or arrogant. To me, it's kind of incredible that I have this kind of scope for Goblins for Good, still was able to get out a playable demo with all this stuff working in like 3 months from my first time touching Unity, my first time doing real programming in a language like C#. Like, I think we could have talked more about, like, I think he could have called me out when I said the game was small scope and then it has all these things. Like, and then speaking of the charity thing, we could have had more of a discussion about the psychological effects that's having on me as a developer, because on the one hand, you might think that it removes some of the pressure to succeed, knowing that I'm not really going to profit from the sales of the game. But in a weird way, it's actually doing the opposite. I feel more pressure for my first game on Steam to do well, like have unrealistic hopes and expectations for it, because I feel like it would be super lame to be raising money for charity only to sell like 0 copies. So in a weird way, it's put more pressure and stress on me, and it's actually, I've had moments where I couldn't work on the game because I felt too much pressure for it to succeed. And I think that could have been an interesting conversation about that contradiction for how like someone like Blake might think I feel less pressure from making a game that I'm not going to profit off of, but actually it's kind of the reverse. So yeah, obviously there's a lot more besides all that, but that's just some of the things I thought about talking about that we didn't have time to talk about on the podcast. Maybe I'll be on there again. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you guys would like me to go into more detail about any of these things. I can always make a video on my channel about it. There's plenty of other things I could have talked about and that we could still talk about on a future episode, but I just thought you'd like a look behind the curtain at what it was like to get on the podcast, what it was like talking to Blake, and some of the things that I wanted to talk about and couldn't. And yeah, subscribe. I'm hoping to have some more devlog style content about Goblins for Good, so if you want to follow the development of that game, you should definitely stick around on my channel, and I'll see you guys later.